Sometimes the ones who fail every test are the ones who were never meant for the test in the first place. The morning air at the K9 training field hung cold and still, stretching across 20 acres of packed dirt, steel obstacles, and silent expectation, where every dog was measured, timed, and judged without mercy. And in the center of it all stood Rex, a German shepherd who hadn't passed a single drill in 3 straight weeks, his handler's voice cutting sharp through the air as commands echoed across the yard. But Rex didn't move. Not the way he was supposed to, not when it mattered, his ears twitching, his eyes drifting somewhere beyond the cones and barriers as if the real world existed just outside the one everyone else could see. And around him, the other handlers exchanged looks, quiet smirks, the kind that said the decision had already been made, that this dog was done, that some animals just didn't have what it took. And maybe they were right, because when the whistle blew again, Rex hesitated 1 second too long, his paws shifting in the dust as the trainer exhaled in frustration, clipboard already lowering as if preparing to mark the final failure. But that was the moment something changed, not loud, not obvious, just a subtle shift in the air, like the wind holding its breath, because at the far edge of the field, near the chain-link fence where shadows stretched long across the ground, a man had stopped walking, tall, quiet, dressed in worn denim and a jacket that carried the weight of years rather than rank. And he didn't call out, didn't interrupt, didn't even step forward. He simply watched, the way someone watches something they recognize before anyone else does. And Rex felt it before he understood it, his body going still in a way that wasn't confusion this time, but focus, his gaze slowly pulling away from the handler, from the cones, from the noise, until it landed on that man. And for a brief moment, the entire field seemed to disappear, no commands, no pressure, no judgment, just a line of awareness stretching between them. Invisible but undeniable, as if something old and unspoken had just been remembered. And somewhere deep inside, past the training, past the failure, past the labels placed on him by people who only saw the surface, Rex listened, not to a voice, not to a command, but to something quieter, something deeper. And though no one else noticed, the man by the fence tilted his head slightly, studying the dog like he was waiting for the right moment, not to teach him, but to let him reveal what had always been there. And maybe that was the first time anyone had ever truly seen Rex, not as a problem to fix, but as a story that hadn't been told yet. And the strange part was, Rex seemed to understand that too. The trainer called Rex back into position, his voice tighter now, sharper, as if trying to force obedience into a space where it no longer fit, and the clipboard tapped once against his leg, a quiet signal that this would be the final attempt, because out here there were no second chances, only results measured in seconds and inches. But Rex did not look at him, not this time, his body still, his breathing slow, his focus anchored somewhere beyond the commands, and a ripple of irritation moved through the handlers standing nearby, one of them muttering that the dog was checked out, that he was not responding again, that this was exactly why he was being removed. Yet none of them noticed how Rex's ears shifted, not randomly, but with precision, turning towards something faint, something distant, something that did not belong to the routine of drills and shouted orders. And near the fence, the man had not moved, not a single step, his posture relaxed but intentional, like someone who understood timing better than urgency, his eyes steady on Rex, not judging, not expecting, simply waiting. And the strange thing was the air between them seemed to carry weight now, as if an invisible line had been drawn across the field, one that no one else could see. But Rex followed without hesitation. And when the command came again, louder this time, sharper, Rex stepped forward, but not toward the cones, not toward the expected path. Instead, he moved in a slow arc, deliberate, controlled, his nose lifting slightly as if catching a trace hidden beneath the scent of dust and metal. And the trainer froze mid-sentence, confusion replacing frustration, because this was not part of the drill. This was not how it was supposed to go. And a second handler took a step forward, ready to intervene. But something in Rex's movement stopped him, something too precise to interrupt, too intentional to dismiss. And then it happened, not loud, not dramatic, just a single, clean sound that cut through everything, a whistle from across the field, sharp and brief, barely louder than the wind brushing the fence, But Rex reacted instantly, not with hesitation, not with confusion, but with recognition, his entire body aligning in one fluid motion as if a switch had been turned deep inside him. And in that moment, the difference was undeniable. His pace shifted, his steps became exact, measured down to the inch, his focus narrowing until nothing else existed, not the trainers, not the noise, not the judgment. Only the task that no one had given him, but he somehow understood, and the man by the fence lowered his hand slowly, stepping aside just enough to clear the line between them. And Rex moved forward with quiet certainty, passing every obstacle without breaking rhythm, his senses tuned to something the rest of the field could not perceive, and behind him, the silence spread, thick and heavy, because for the first time, no one was speaking, no one was correcting, no one was writing anything down. They were only watching, trying to understand how a dog they had already given up on was now moving like he had been waiting for this moment all along. And somewhere in that stillness, the truth began to surface, not fully seen yet, not fully understood, but impossible to ignore, that Rex had never been failing. He had simply been listening for something no one else knew how to say. The field did not erupt in applause or noise. It fell into something heavier, a silence that pressed against the chest, because what they were watching did not fit into any category they understood, and Rex continued forward without breaking stride, his nose dipping once, then lifting again as if tracing something that moved beneath the surface of the earth itself, his paws landing with quiet certainty across the packed dirt, bypassing markers that had been carefully placed for every other dog, ignoring the artificial paths designed to measure obedience, because whatever he was following was not part of the drill, and yet it was more precise than anything the drill could offer, and the trainers exchanged uncertain glances, one of them lowering his clipboard completely now, his pen still, as if writing anything would break whatever was unfolding in front of them. And near the fence, the man remained still, his eyes never leaving Rex, not with pride, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet recognition, like someone watching a story reach the part he already knew was coming. And when Rex slowed, it was not hesitation, it was arrival. His body lowering slightly, muscles coiled but calm, his gaze fixed on a section of ground near the far boundary, a place that looked no different than any other, just dust and scattered gravel under a pale morning sky. But Rex did not move past it. He stood there, completely still, his ears forward, his breathing steady, waiting, and the trainers looked at each other again, confusion now giving way to something closer to unease, because the system had not flagged anything there. There was no marker, no target, no reason for the dog to stop, and yet he did not budge, not even when his handler called his name, not even when the command was repeated louder, sharper, carrying that familiar edge of control. But Rex did not respond to control anymore. He was responding to something else, something quieter, something that had finally been given space to surface. And after a long moment, one of the instructors stepped forward, slow, cautious, as if approaching something fragile, his boots crunching softly against the ground as he moved toward the spot where Rex stood. And when he reached it, he paused, looking down, then back at the others, uncertain, before crouching and brushing aside a thin layer of dust with his hand, and beneath it, just barely visible, was a small, hidden indicator, something not part of the standard course, something placed there without announcement, a test within a test, designed to measure instinct rather than obedience. And the realization moved through the group like a quiet wave, because none of the other dogs had found it, not one. And yet Rex had gone straight to it without guidance, without command, without hesitation, and behind them, the man by the fence finally took a step forward, slow and deliberate, closing the distance without urgency. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying no need to explain more than necessary, as he said that some dogs are trained to follow orders, but others are trained to notice what everyone else misses. And Rex, still standing over the hidden marker, turned his head slightly, not toward the trainers, not toward the handler, but toward the man, as if confirming something that had already been decided long before this morning. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching that the test had never been about whether Rex could pass. It had been about whether anyone else could understand what he was actually built to do. No one spoke for several long seconds, not because they had nothing to say, but because something deeper had settled over the field, the kind of realization that does not arrive loudly but instead unfolds slowly, like light through fog, and Rex remained exactly where he was, steady over the hidden marker, his body relaxed but alert, as if the task was not complete yet, as if there was still something more to understand. And the man stepped closer now, his boots quiet against the dirt, closing the final distance until he stood just a few feet away, not reaching for the dog, not issuing a command, only standing within that invisible line that had connected them from the very beginning. And for a moment, Rex did not move, his eyes lifting slightly to meet the man's, and there was something in that look that the others could not fully explain, not obedience, not training, but recognition, as if the dog had been waiting for someone who spoke the same language without words. And one of the trainers finally broke the silence, his voice uncertain, asking how the dog had done it, how he had found something no one else even knew was there. And the man did not answer right away, his gaze still on Rex, studying him with quiet patience before he spoke, saying that the problem was never the dog, it was the way they were asking him to think, that not every mind is built to follow a straight line, and not every instinct fits inside a checklist. And the words settled heavily across the group, because they knew he was right, even if they did not want to admit it. And the handler shifted his stance, looking at Rex differently now, not with frustration, but with a kind of hesitant respect, as if seeing him for the first time. And Rex slowly stepped back from the marker, not in retreat, but in completion, the way a task ends when it has been fully understood. And then, without being called, without a leash, without a signal from anyone in charge, he turned, his body angling naturally toward the man, each step calm, deliberate, as if guided by something that had nothing to do with the rules of the field. And a few of the handlers exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene, unsure whether they even had the authority to stop what was happening, because this did not feel like disobedience, it felt like alignment. And when Rex finally reached him, he did not sit, did not wait for a command, he simply stood beside the man, close enough that their shadows overlapped on the ground, and the man lowered his hand, resting it gently along the dog's neck, not as a gesture of control, but of acknowledgement. And for the first time that morning, Rex's posture softened, not into weakness, but into something like ease, as if a tension he had carried for weeks had finally been released. And the man spoke again, quieter this time, almost as if the words were meant only for the dog, saying that some signals are not taught, they are remembered. And as the wind moved lightly across the field, carrying dust and silence in equal measure, it became clear to everyone watching that this moment was not the end of a failed test, but the beginning of something none of them had been trained to recognize. The field did not return to normal after that moment, even as the wind shifted and the trainers slowly lowered their hands, because something unseen had already changed the balance of everything they thought they understood. And the man remained beside Rex without urgency, his presence steady, almost quiet enough to be overlooked if not for the way the dog stayed anchored to him, not by command, but by choice. And one of the senior instructors finally stepped forward, his boots pressing firm into the dirt as he tried to reclaim a sense of order, asking the man directly who he was and what exactly he had done, because no standard signal should have produced a response like that. And the man turned slightly, his expression calm, not defensive, not proud, simply certain, and he said that he had not given the dog anything new, only something familiar, something the dog already understood long before this place tried to redefine him. And that answer lingered in the air, heavier than any explanation, because it suggested something none of them were prepared to accept, that Rex had never been broken, only misplaced. And the instructor glanced back at the hidden marker, then at the path Rex had taken to reach it, realizing how direct it had been, how efficient, how completely free of hesitation. And he asked how a dog labeled as unresponsive could perform with that level of clarity. And the man took a slow breath, his eyes drifting briefly across the field before returning to Rex. And he said that some dogs are trained to respond to pressure, to noise, to repetition, but others are trained in silence, in environments where hesitation is not corrected, but understood, where instinct is not suppressed, but sharpened. And when those dogs are placed in the wrong system, They do not fail. They wait. And that word settled deeper than the others, because waiting was not something they measured here. It was not something they rewarded, and yet it explained everything they had just witnessed. And the handler who had been working with Rex stepped closer now, his earlier frustration replaced with something quieter, almost regret, as he looked at the dog standing calmly beside the man. And he admitted that he had tried everything, every command, every correction, every method he knew, and none of it worked. And the man nodded slightly, not dismissing the effort, but recognizing its limitation. And he said that the dog had not been ignoring him. He had been listening for something else, something the handler had never been taught to give. And that realization hung in the space between them, not as blame, but as truth. And Rex shifted his weight slightly, leaning just enough toward the man to show where his attention now lived. And it was not forced, not trained in that moment, but natural, like a compass finally pointing in the right direction. And one of the younger handlers whispered under his breath, asking what kind of training could create that kind of bond. And the man glanced down at Rex before answering, saying that it was not just training, it was trust built in places where words were too slow and commands came too late. And for a brief second, something passed through his eyes, not visible enough to name, but deep enough to be felt, like a memory carried quietly. And then he looked back at the group and said that the real question was not whether the dog could stay, but whether this place was built to understand what he was capable of becoming. And no one answered, because for the first time, they were not sure they had the right system to measure what they had just seen. And as the morning light shifted slightly across the field, stretching longer shadows behind them, Rex stood still, calm and certain, as if the waiting was finally over. The question did not leave the air after it was spoken. It settled there, lingering between the instructors and the man, as if waiting for someone brave enough to answer it. And yet no one did, because deep down they all felt the same quiet uncertainty, that maybe the system they trusted had limits they had never considered before. And the senior instructor slowly exhaled, shifting his weight as he looked out across the field, the same field that had once felt predictable, controlled, measurable, but now seemed unfamiliar in a way he could not fully explain. And he finally said that every dog here was trained for consistency, for reliability, for results that could be repeated again and again, because that was what made them dependable. And the man listened without interrupting, his hand still resting lightly against Rex, before replying in a calm, steady tone that consistency is valuable, but it is not the same as awareness. And the distinction between those two ideas settled heavily across the group, because they had spent years perfecting one without ever questioning the other. And the younger handler who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, curiosity now replacing hesitation, asking what would happen to a dog like Rex if he stayed here, if he continued to be trained under the same structure. And the man did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting briefly toward the far end of the field where the obstacles stood in perfect rows, then back to Rex. And he said quietly that eventually the dog would learn to ignore what made him different, not because it disappeared, but because it was never acknowledged. And over time, that kind of silence changes an animal, not outwardly at first, but deeper, in the way it listens, in the way it trusts, until what once made it exceptional becomes something it no longer reaches for. And the words carried a weight that no one could dismiss, because they recognized the truth in it, even if it was uncomfortable. And the handler who had worked with Rex looked down at the ground for a moment, his jaw tightening slightly as he absorbed what he was hearing. And when he looked back up, there was something different in his expression, not defeat, but understanding. And he asked the man what kind of environment Rex would need instead, what kind of training could actually match what he had just shown. And the man's answer was simple, almost quiet enough to miss. He said the dog did not need more training. He needed the right partnership. And that idea shifted something fundamental in the room, because it reframed everything they had believed about control and command. And Rex, as if sensing the shift, adjusted his stance slightly, stepping closer to the man, not in dependence, but in alignment, his presence calm, grounded, as if he had already made a decision no one else had the authority to question. And the wind moved again across the field, softer now, carrying the faint scent of dust and metal. And for a moment, the entire group stood still, caught between what they had always known and what they were only beginning to understand. And in that quiet space, It became clear that this was no longer about whether Rex could pass a test. It was about whether anyone here was ready to change the way they saw him at all. The silence did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt like a threshold, the kind that separates what was from what could be. And the senior instructor finally straightened his posture, not in resistance, but in recognition that something irreversible had already taken place. And he looked at the man with a steadier gaze now, asking a different kind of question, not about the dog, but about him, about where he had learned to see what others had missed. And the man paused for a moment, as if deciding how much of that answer belonged here, in a place built on structure and clarity. Before he spoke, saying that there are environments where signals are not repeated, where hesitation costs more than time, and where trust is not built through commands, but through presence. And the words were simple, but they carried the weight of experience that did not need to be explained in detail. And one of the handlers quietly asked if Rex had come from a place like that, and the man gave a slight nod, not confirming everything, but enough to shift the understanding of everyone standing there. Because it meant the dog had not been trained for performance, but for perception, not for routine, but for moments that could not be predicted. And that realization settled deeply, because it reframed every mistake they had recorded, every hesitation they had corrected, every moment they had misunderstood as failure. And suddenly those moments looked different, not like errors, but like pauses. Like the dog had been waiting for something specific, something precise, something only a certain kind of signal could unlock. And the handler who had worked with Rex took a slow step forward, his voice quieter now, asking if the dog would respond to anyone else the same way, or if it was something unique to the man standing beside him. And the answer came without hesitation. The man said that trust like this is not transferable. It is built over time, through consistency of a different kind, not repetition, but reliability in moments that matter. And the handler nodded slowly, understanding that this was not something he could replicate overnight, not something he could fix with a new technique, but something that required a different way of seeing entirely. And Rex shifted again, his tail low but steady, his posture relaxed, as if the tension that had once defined him had completely dissolved. And for the first time since he had arrived at the facility, he looked like a dog that was exactly where he was supposed to be, not struggling, not confused, but aligned. And the younger handler spoke again, almost to himself, wondering how many other dogs might be misunderstood in the same way. How many had been labeled incorrectly simply because they did not respond to the system in front of them. And no one answered, because it was a question that reached beyond Rex, beyond this moment, into something larger that none of them had considered before. And the man glanced across the field one last time, his eyes moving over the obstacles, the markers, the carefully designed structure that had once defined success here. And then he looked back at Rex, and without raising his voice, without giving a command, he took a single step forward, and Rex moved with him instantly, not because he was told to, but because he chose to. And that was the moment the difference became undeniable, not just to the instructors, not just to the handler, but to everyone standing there, that this was no longer about training, it was about connection, and connection, once recognized, changes everything. The movement was so natural that it almost went unnoticed at first, just a man taking a step and a dog following. But the difference was in the way Rex followed, not a half second behind, not waiting for confirmation, but in perfect alignment, as if the decision had already been made before the step even happened. And the instructors watched closely now, no longer trying to control the situation, but trying to understand it, because this was something they had never trained for, a response without command, a connection without structure. And the senior instructor spoke again, his voice quieter, asking what would happen next, not to challenge, but to learn. And the man paused briefly, his eyes scanning the field one last time before answering that what happens next depends on whether they are willing to let the dog become what he already is. And that answer did not provide clarity, but it opened something deeper, something that required them to reconsider the very foundation of how they define success. And the handler who had worked with Rex stepped closer, his expression no longer defensive, but reflective, as if he was replaying every moment he had spent trying to correct what he now realized he had never fully understood. And he admitted softly that he had been trying to make the dog fit the system instead of asking whether the system fit the dog. And the words carried a quiet weight, because they applied far beyond this one moment. and Rex stood calmly beside the man, his posture steady, his breathing even, no longer scanning the field for direction, but grounded in something more certain. And one of the younger handlers asked if the dog would still be able to work within any structure at all, or if he required something entirely different, and the man gave a slight nod, explaining that structure is not the problem, but it must be flexible enough to recognize instinct, that the best systems do not suppress awareness, they guide it. And that distinction settled deeply across the group, because it suggested that their approach was not wrong, but incomplete. And the wind shifted again, carrying a soft rustle through the distant trees beyond the fence, and, for a moment, the entire field seemed to pause, as if giving space for this realization to take root. And the senior instructor finally lowered his clipboard completely, no longer needing it, because there was nothing left to measure in the way he once understood, and he looked at the man with a quiet respect, asking one final question, not about the dog, but about the choice, whether Rex would stay here or leave with him. And the man did not answer right away. Instead, he looked down at Rex, his hand resting gently along the dog's neck. And for a brief moment, everything became still again, not uncertain, but clear, because the answer did not belong to the man. It never had. And Rex lifted his head slightly, his eyes steady, his body relaxed but certain, and then, without hesitation, without command, he took a step forward in the same direction the man had chosen earlier, not because he was told to follow, but because he understood where he belonged. And in that quiet, undeniable movement, the decision revealed itself without a single word being spoken. The field did not return to noise or routine after that moment. It held on to the quiet, as if something important had passed through it and left a trace behind. And the instructors stood where they were, not out of confusion anymore, but out of respect for what they had just witnessed, because there are moments that cannot be measured, only understood in silence. And Rex continued forward beside the man, not rushing, not hesitating, each step steady, grounded, as if the direction had always been clear to him even when no one else could see it. And the handler who had once tried to correct him took a slow breath, watching the dog walk away with a look that was no longer frustration, but something closer to acceptance. Because he realized now that Rex had never been resisting him. He had simply been waiting for something he could not provide, and that realization did not feel like failure. It felt like clarity, and the senior instructor lowered his gaze briefly before looking back up, his voice softer now as he spoke, not to stop them, but to acknowledge what had changed, saying that not every path begins inside a system, and not every outcome can be trained into existence. And the words carried across the field like a quiet conclusion, not final, but complete in its own way. And the man did not respond with more explanation, because there was nothing left to explain. Some truths do not need to be repeated once they are seen. And Rex walked at his side, his posture calm, his breathing even, no longer searching, no longer waiting, because the signal he had been listening for had finally found him. And as they reached the edge of the field, near the same fence where it had all begun, the man paused for just a moment, not turning back, not hesitating, simply standing still as if marking the end of one chapter before stepping into another. And Rex stopped with him, his gaze forward, his presence quiet but certain. And behind them, the field remained unchanged in its structure, the cones still in place, the obstacles still aligned, but something within it had shifted, something that would stay long after they were gone, because those who had watched would never see failure the same way again. And as the man took one final step beyond the boundary, Rex followed without question, not because he had been trained to, but because he had chosen to. And sometimes the most powerful command is the one that is never spoken, because it is understood before it is ever given. And as the distance between them and the field slowly grew, the lesson they left behind remained, quiet but lasting, that not everything that looks like failure is meant to be fixed. Some things are meant to be understood, and when they are, they do not just change direction, they change everything.